Hey, this is Russell Moore, and this is Reading in Exile, where we go through the library here, pull a book off the shelf, and talk about it. And today, I'd like to talk about Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham Jail. I have it included in this signet paperback called Why We Can't Wait, but you can find it any number of places in lots of collections. You can find it online for free. But I really recommend this letter to you. And there's some of you who have asked, if I want to start in reading MLK, where do I go? And I would say start here, especially if you're an evangelical Christian, because what King is dealing with a lot in this letter is speaking specifically to religious people and especially professing born-again Christians, white professing born-again Christians, who he's talking to largely here. And if you think about what's going on in the background, Dr. King is invited into Birmingham to participate in and to lead peaceful protest, peaceful nonviolent civil disobedience. And he's arrested. He ends up in jail. And as he's there, there's a statement that comes out from a group of white clergy that Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, that is called, I think it was called a call to unity. And they had done another one called a call to law and order or something like that. And now this wasn't the sort of thing that you were getting from the White Citizens Council or even from a lot of churches and pastors. This was not trying to be hard-edged segregationist. As a matter of fact, this call to unity was trying to say, well, we support your goals, but we don't support the way that you're getting there. And they had a list of critiques as to why that is. You shouldn't break the law. You should do this through the courts. Don't do this through protests. And underneath it all, fundamentally was, you ought to wait. This is getting better. It's going to get better. So just be patient and it will get better. So what Dr. King does is to sit there and write this letter. And I have to tell you, I'm very amazed that somebody's able to write this letter with no access to a library with him. He's just simply writing this out of what he has already taken in and thought about and processed. But he writes this letter that's dealing with a number of different points. One of them has to do with this language about you shouldn't break the law. So he starts going through the Christian tradition specifically, both in Book of Acts, but also in Thomas Aquinas and beyond, about the nature of just laws and unjust laws, and about the fact that an obedience to an unjust law that goes against conscience, what the Christian tradition has said about that, how he is consistent with that. And he takes on the issue where they're saying you ought to just let the courts deal with this in order to say there has to be I think the language he used was creative tension that takes place where there is an appeal to the conscience of those who have ultimate responsibility for the laws and for the interpretation of the laws. Because he knows otherwise, you don't get the Voting Rights Act without Selma. He knows that. That happens later, but the fundamental dynamic is at work there. But also he knows you can have all sorts of court decisions and that can simply not be followed, can be nullified by the states, which was happening. And Brown versus Board was decided in 1954. This is 1963. And it still is not being realized. So he talks about that. And then he deals with this question of religion and about the hypocrisy of people who are, he uses this language of anesthetizing stained glass windows. So he's saying that there's this sense of silent acquiescence to Jim Crow, and that people are saying just be patient and just wait. But when you do that, he says you're waiting on the oppressor to voluntarily decide to give rights to the oppressed, rights that aren't divvied out by the majority. These are rights that are endowed by God. The Declaration of Independence language there, natural rights. That doesn't happen. It can never happen. So that the patience idea doesn't work, but also because there's this idea, and it persists with us still, of this impersonal force of history that will just take care of things. It just takes care of them. And you think about it, it's easy to get into that mindset and to say, I can't believe it's 2020, and you still have the sorts of injustices that would see Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and countless others murdered. Well, history doesn't deal with it impersonally. People have to, with consciences that are alive and responsive to justice and injustice, sin and righteousness. And that's what Dr. King is talking about here, and talking about the responsibility that comes not just to, he'll talk about in other contexts, the responsibilities of African American communities in the Jim Crow South to speak. But he's talking here to the very comfortable white churches. And if you want to see sort of how this can play out, look at the life of one of the signers that he actually praises in this letter, Reverend Stallings at the First Baptist Church of Birmingham, white pastor who, unlike most of the pastors in the Jim Crow South, would allow African American people to come into the church and to worship. He was saying, no, let's go slow, let's be moderate, but he was also not lining up with segregation, which meant he was going to end up losing his position, losing his place of influence in that community. And so Dr. King is speaking to him and to people like him, saying, listen to your conscience as informed by the Word of God. Don't be afraid. Do what you know to be right. And what Dr. King understood is that there's a lot at stake. Somebody who would stand up and say, despite the fact that the Bible talks about this everywhere, from Genesis, in which God creates everybody from one blood in the image of God, through the way that God reveals his standards for justice toward one another in Deuteronomy and in Proverbs, the way that the prophets consistently speak to the mistreatment of the vulnerable, of the poor, of the stranger, to the way that Jesus talks about this in terms of the widow of Zarephath and Naaman the Syrian in his hometown synagogue. The way that Jesus puts his church together in the book of Acts, the way that the Apostle Paul writes about this in Galatians and in Ephesians, the way that James talks about injustice and responsibilities for injustice, about the sin of partiality, the way that John writes about hatred of brother and what that reveals about one's relationship to God. Despite the fact this is everywhere, the same sort of thing that King is talking about here shows up when someone simply speaks about those things. People are going to say, well, you're being divisive, or you're being political. Despite often these are people who are political about 1,000 things that the Bible doesn't even talk about. But the stuff the Bible does, they say, oh, it's a social issue. It's a distraction from the gospel of Jesus Christ. Or they'll try to find ways to investigate you or suggest that you're a liberal, you're a communist, you're being funded by some shadowy outside organization. All of these things to try to discredit the person. That went on then, it goes on now. But letter from Birmingham Jail, what Dr. King is saying is, stand. You know what's right. You know what's right. You have an accountability, not before the impersonal forces of history, but before a personal God who recognizes and loves justice and for whom Black lives do matter. This is Russell Moore, and this is Reading in Exile. Let me know in the comments what you would like for us to talk about here on Reading in Exile next time.